Okay, everyone. Well, thank you very much for joining the webinar this evening. And I'm really sorry about our technical problems at the start. We've been slightly overwhelmed by the reaction tonight and to have so many people join us, which is a real treat. And I think it's probably testament to just how much interest there is in Ospreys, not just in Britain, but across the world. So it's really fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. And as I say, this talk, some of you I know will have seen some of the talks I've given on Osprey migration in the past, but this talk is slightly different. It's one I haven't done before, although there might be some slides you've seen before, that's talking specifically about spring migration, because I always think a real highlight is when you see an Osprey back at its nest for the first time in the spring, having just completed this incredible migration. And we know that Ospreys are the most remarkable navigators and undertake some incredible journeys. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about that over the course of the next hour. And then, like I said, there'll be some time for some questions at the end. Anyway, the real excitement, certainly for those of us in Rutland and many of you who will be following online yesterday, is that the Manton Bay birds returned. So Maya and 33 returned. And I thought what was just quite incredible about this, and it's now happened several times, is that the two of them arrived on the same day. And yet we know that adult Ospreys, despite the fact that they mate for life, winter in different places. So these two will have flown from potentially completely different parts of Africa or maybe even Southern Europe and returned on the same day. And what a miracle of migration that is. And the reason we know so much about Osprey migration really is because of some of the advances in satellite tracking technology that there have been over the last 2 decades. So the first Ospreys were satellite tagged by Roy Dennis, Perty Sorolla and others in the mid to late 90s when we were just starting the Rutland Translocation project. And obviously over the past few decades, the technology has evolved all the time, and now we can track birds in incredible detail, in some cases second by second as they migrate, and that has really greatly enhanced our understanding of the amazing journeys they do. And before I get into some of those journeys, it's important just to remind ourselves about where Ospreys occur and where they go. So we know that it's a species with a real global distribution. So there's 4 recognized subspecies of Osprey, and 2 of those subspecies are almost fully migratory. So Pandion haliatus, the nominate subspecies which occurs through Europe and into Asia, that is a migratory subspecies. And as you can see there, birds from Northern Europe migrate to sub-Saharan Africa, and birds further east in Russia migrate down into Southeast Asia for the winter. And then if you go across the other side of the Atlantic, you've got Pandion haliatus carolinensis, which is the North American race. And you can see there that North American birds migrate from breeding grounds across the United States and Canada, right the way down into Central and Southern America. And then, of course, there are the other 2 races, the Australasian one, Cristatus, and Ridgwayi in the Caribbean, which tend to be sedentary. So the Australasian birds do make sort of post fledging movements, and they disperse away from their natal nest, but often you will get adult birds that are sedentary around the year. And even in Southern Europe and southern parts of the United States, the birds that breed at southerly latitudes often don't migrate. So birds in the Mediterranean and those in Florida will often be sedentary, but all of those that breed at higher latitudes, whether that be in North America or in Europe, they're migratory. And within Europe, there are several key flyways. Our birds in the UK tend to migrate down through France. Some will winter in Spain and Portugal, and there's an increasing trend for that. But then most of the birds then continue south across the Sahara, and birds from the UK, from Germany, from France, they tend to winter in West Africa, anywhere really from Mauritania south to places like Guinea and the Ivory Coast. And then birds that breed further east in Europe, so Finland, Eastern Europe, so Latvia, Lithuania, those birds, some will go on a western migration route and go to West Africa, but others will go down through Eastern Europe and then the Middle East and migrate all the way down, in some cases, right the way to the southern tip of South Africa. So the thing with the osprey is that they do have the capacity to make these absolutely incredible migrations of thousands of miles. And one of the really interesting things is that they're regarded as fly and forage migrants. So fly and forage, well, the clue's in the name, really. Basically, they stop off in suitable places along their migration and they feed up as they go. So they're not like a migrant that takes on a huge amount of fat and that gets it through almost the entirety of its migration. The osprey, when it's on migration, will often roost near water. And certainly when they're migrating through places like Europe, they'll roost near water and they'll catch a fish either that evening or the next morning before they resume their migration. Obviously, there are certain parts of the journey when they can't feed. So when they're flying across the Sahara, for example, but when there is the opportunity to feed, they generally will. And this is just stuff to bear in mind as we go through the presentation. Now, the other thing about ospreys is that they are incredibly well adapted at migration. And again, we know this because of satellite tracking. And if I've just clicked on too quickly, we know not just where they go on migration, but how they fly, how they migrate. And ospreys are regarded as what's called facultative soaring migrants. And what that basically means is that at times when you've got thermal updrafts, the birds will migrate by soaring gliding flight. So you've got a cross section there showing an osprey's migration across the Sahara Desert. And the red dots are a GPS fix, which in this case were logged every 45 seconds to a minute. And they show the changes in altitude and then the movement from right to left across the screen. And basically what's happening there is that the bird is reaching a thermal updraft. It's then circling in the thermal to gain height. It reaches the top of the thermal and then it opens its wings and it glides forward. So rather than having to use powered flight to gain forward momentum, that bird is basically just gliding downwards and it's using the altitude it's gained for its forward momentum. So it opens its wings, it glides forward. And of course, what that means is that that's a very energetically effective way of migrating, because you're basically using the thermal dynamics of the earth to facilitate your migration. But the thing with ospreys is that they are extremely well adapted to different types of flights. So yes, they can exploit thermal updrafts, but they've got these really long, narrow wings, which reduce drag. And that means that when they have to make active flapping flight, so when there aren't thermal updrafts, perhaps when they're flying over the sea, their flight is much less energetically costly than it is for a much bigger raptor, like say a vulture. And what that means is that basically, yes, they will migrate over land, but they can also make really long flights across the sea. And some of the research we've done into sea crossings in ospreys shows that often when they're flying across the sea, they're just flying at very low altitude, almost just above the waves. But at other times, they're actually able to attain soaring gliding flight like they do over land, because they can even exploit very weak sea thermals that you sometimes get in the autumn, which is caused by the water temperature. And basically, that means that they can gain altitude in a similar way as they do over land, and attain, as I say, that soaring gliding flight. So all of this stuff basically means that the osprey is, pretty uniquely adapted to undertake these really long and arduous migrations. Some birds of prey, like vultures, they're very much confined to flight over land. That's why places like the Straits of Gibraltar, if you go to Tarifa in southern Spain, you get huge accumulations of migrating raptors who basically are bottlenecked down to the shortest sea crossings. Whereas ospreys don't need to do that because of their morphology, because of the way they're built. They can make really long flights over the sea, but then they can also utilize thermal updrafts when they're crossing the Sahara. So basically, they're supremely well adapted to undertaking these migrations. And so when you see a bird like Maya or like 33 back on their nest at Rutland Water, I always think it's just incredible and pretty humbling to think what they've experienced in the previous days, weeks. And as I say, being able to follow individual birds on migration has really been possible thanks to satellite tracking, thanks to the small satellite tags that we fit onto the backs of the birds using a Teflon harness, which really give us an insight into their lives, into their absolutely incredible lives. And one of the birds that I'm going to talk about this evening is a bird who I personally have known for a very long time, since she hatched in 2005, because that year she hatched at the Site B nest at Rutland Water. And we were doing a 24-hour guard of that nest. And I was one of the people who was charged with watching the nest at night, because we were worried about egg collectors back then. And so protected that nest over the course of the incubation period. And then happily, the chicks hatched. And one of the chicks that year was 30. So 3005. And she bred for the first time in 2009. She bred at a site in Northamptonshire that we call Site K. She bred there for a number of years with a male that we translocated to Rutland Water, Red 08. And then in 2015, she moved to another site in Northamptonshire that we call Site S, and she's been breeding there since 2015. So she will be 21 years old this summer. And she so far reared 27 chicks in her lifespan. So she really is a real one of these super ospreys that we see that has produced a lot of chicks and lived for a long time. Well, last year she actually returned on the 17th of March, and which, as you will see, is probably going to be much earlier than she is this year. But the exciting thing with 30 is that in 2013, when she wasn't breeding that year, it was a year when she wasn't breeding, we actually caught her under license and we fitted her with a satellite tag. And that satellite tag worked for a total of 5 years and enabled us to follow her annual migrations from her wintering site in Senegal, as it turned out, to her breeding site, which was in, well, subsequently was turned out to be in Northamptonshire. So before we get into her spring migrations, I think it's worth remembering what ospreys do in the winter, which, to be quite honest with you, is not very much. So this is some data that we have from 30 on her wintering site. So she's the white tracks on the map, and about 2 kilometers up the coast. This is the Grand Coast of Senegal, about halfway between Dakar and St. Louis on the west coast of Africa, is another bird that we satellite tagged at Rutland Water, 0998. And this map really just shows you how sedentary adult ospreys are in the winter. Basically, they'll have their favorite patch of sand on the beach, a favorite bit of driftwood, or just some sand that they sit on every day. And that's where they will spend every day of the winter. They'll fly out to sea perhaps once or twice a day, catch a fish or two, but for the rest of the time, they're just resting. They're recuperating from the previous breeding season, and they're going to be there probably for 6 months, from around about the middle to late September through to the early part of March. So it's a time when ospreys can relax on the beach. And if you go to this part of Senegal, it is incredible the number of ospreys that winter along this coastline. This is a photo that was taken by my colleague John Wright. In fact, many of the photos in this talk are taken by John. And if you count the ospreys in that photo, you can actually see 14 different birds. And what I love about this is that you can't see from this photo, but basically there will be ospreys there from all over Europe. They could be from Scandinavia, from France, perhaps from Eastern Europe, perhaps from the UK. And they've all traveled to get to this patch of coastline in Senegal, and they go to that particular spot because that's the place they found as a juvenile after their first migration, and that's the place they regard their winter home. So just as they've got an established nest further south, further north, this is the place that is their winter home for 6 months of the year. And this is a really important place because basically this is somewhere they actually spend more of their life than they do at their nest site. So it's important for an osprey to find a good wintering site. And this part of the Senegalese coastline has seen a really rapid increase in the number of ospreys that are wintering there. So there was a survey done by a guy called Prevost in 1982. He was doing his PhD on ospreys, and he surveyed ospreys along the Senegalese coastline, and he recorded just under 100 ospreys along that particular stretch of coastline on the Grand Coast. And then that survey was repeated by Jean-Marie Dupart in 2022. Jean-Marie is someone who many of you will be familiar with because he lives in Senegal. He's a French ornithologist and does some fantastic work monitoring that population all through the winter. And you can see there that in 2022, he recorded well over 350 birds on that particular stretch of coastline. So it really shows you how, as the population of ospreys in Europe has increased, which it very much is doing, then obviously so too is the wintering population in West Africa. Anyway, what about 30's particular migrations to and from Senegal and England? Well, what we really discovered from following her and from following other ospreys on migration is that spring is often a more demanding migration than autumn. So if you look at the average duration of the autumn migrations that we followed for 30, and you've got 3 of them on screen here, which are the orange tracks, her average autumn migration to get to her patch of sand on the Senegalese coast from Northamptonshire was just 12 days. So she was averaging between about 250 and 300 miles a day. And her autumn migrations, I think, are notable for the fact there's such a direct flight. The spring journey, on the other hand, typically took quite a bit longer. So it took on average 6 days longer and took an average of 18 days. So you can really see there that that spring migration is potentially more difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is often due to the wind. Now, I should point out in this map that you'll see a very strange point there that goes north from Senegal into the sea. That's just an error, one erroneous satellite tagging point. So just ignore that. But if you look there at the red tracks, they are 2 of 30's spring migrations compared to the white tracks, which are autumn migrations. And you can see there at the start of her winter migration, in 2 years, she had a really difficult beginning. So she's not making that direct flight northeast, as you would expect. So, yeah, northeast. She's actually kind of diverging away from that. And so what you start to see is that the birds that are migrating from West Africa really are at a disadvantage compared to those ones that winter in Iberia. So I think that a lot of the early arriving ospreys that we see arriving really from anything from about the 10th, 11th, 12th of March, they are birds probably that have wintered in Spain or Portugal. Whereas the ones that come from Africa, I mean, it goes without saying, doesn't it? It's further, but quite often the environmental conditions that they have to overcome are challenging, not just when they get into Europe, when obviously the weather can be quite poor in March, but also down in West Africa. And to understand why we see these tracks, you have to think about how ospreys adapt to the wind. So there are 3 ways that a migrating osprey can respond to crosswind. So I'm talking here about adult ospreys that have done migrations before. And what we found is that adult ospreys will respond to crosswinds differently depending on where they are on their migratory journey. So the 3 ways they can respond are by allowing themselves to be drifted by the wind. So that's not fighting it, just basically if there's an easterly crosswind, then you drift to the east. They can compensate for it. So if there's an easterly crosswind, then they have to change their track more to the west to compensate for that, to go in the intended direction. Or in some cases, they might overcompensate for the wind and therefore kind of go too far in the other direction. And what an osprey does in terms of that really depends on what stage of the journey it's at. So at the start, if you think about it, at the start of the migration, there's not a lot of point in an osprey like 30 fighting too hard against the wind, because the trouble with compensating for a crosswind is it's much more energetically costly. So you're having to use more energy to fight the wind than to just let yourself submit to wind drift and to kind of perhaps go off course, but not lose so much energy in the process. And so what you're seeing here are 2 springs where in one spring there were strong winds from the east, so they're blowing to the east, and then another year sorry, when they were blowing from the west to east, which took her east, and then another year where there were easterly winds blowing to the west, which took her to the west. And so you can see there that rather than just beginning her migration in a kind of direct northeasterly track, she's having to respond to how the wind's blowing her. And of course, what that means is that flight across the Sahara is taking longer. So ospreys intentionally submit to wind drift at the beginning of migration. However, as they approach their destination, so their destination might be the final destination, might be the nest site, but it could also be intermediate points on the migration, which we call goal areas. So there are certain places that an osprey will pass through on every migration. Now you can imagine that you can't allow yourself to go with the wind if you're trying to navigate to a specific spot. So as a bird approaches a specific point of its migration, it will then start to battle the wind, and it will attempt to compensate for crosswinds in order to get to a specific spot. So they compensate for crosswinds when they're approaching goal areas or when they're approaching their final destination. And the other thing, of course, when they're going across the Sahara that can make it really difficult is that these really strong winds create dust storms, which obviously make migration even more challenging. So, that makes navigation harder, because we know that ospreys will use some geographical cues to aid their migration. So there are certain ridges that run across the Sahara that some birds will follow. So there's no doubt that the dust storms make that flight across the Sahara really challenging. And that can be in autumn or spring. But it seems to be that in spring, these winds can be really difficult. And there's no doubt that when you get an osprey that might arrive a week or 2 weeks late, it's not necessarily because it's had a demanding journey through Europe. It could be because it's really struggled to cross the Sahara. So strong winds and dust storms are a real problem for an osprey that's wintered in West Africa. Now, when 30 gets to Europe, you can see here that just about every journey, whether it be spring or autumn, she's always crossed very close to the Straits of Gibraltar. So I mentioned earlier that ospreys can make long sea crossings, but she typically crosses quite close to Tarifa and then flies up through central France, central Spain, and then up the Atlantic coast of France. But there's a very obvious difference there between spring and autumn. What we found is that in autumn, she'd often make quite long flights across the English Channel and sometimes the Bay of Biscay. But in spring, she always used that route further to the east, where she was going up towards the shortest point of the English Channel from Dover to Calais or close to it in order to cross. And this very much replicates a trend that we see across many ospreys from the UK, that they're much more likely to make sea crossings in the autumn than they are in the spring. And that's because in the spring, as you will see in a minute, there are quite often northerly winds which really limit their process, the time they take to get north. Whereas in the autumn, if you've got northerly winds, of course, that provides you with a great tailwind with which you can cross the sea. And although ospreys are really good at crossing the sea, they're only going to attempt to do it generally when there are favorable conditions. So they'll make a long flight over the Bay of Biscay if they've got a tailwind, but they'll try and avoid it if they've got a headwind. And certainly with the birds that we followed from the UK, that has tended to be the case. So what we see, certainly from the birds that migrate from the UK, the sea crossings are much more common in autumn when weather conditions are usually more favorable than they are in the spring. Now, the interesting thing about 30 this year is that she was actually seen at her wintering site this year by Jean-Marie Dupart on the 13th of March. So she's going to be, without doubt, much later arriving than she did last spring. So last spring she was arrived, I've put here the 18th, I think it was actually the 17th. And when you think that her average spring migration is 18 days, it's likely that this year she's not going to arrive until perhaps the middle part of next week, the 31st of March, maybe the 1st of April, 2nd of April. And Jean-Marie reported a couple of weeks ago that there were strong northerly winds which seemed to be holding up those ospreys before they set off north. So you can really see that In some years, we've had lots of arrivals very early, whereas this year it's been notable that quite a few early arriving birds have been quite late, and a bird like 30 is likely to be much later than she was last year. And that is simply due to the weather that she's having to battle as she goes north. So when you start to think about the fact that she's 21 years old and the number of migrations she's done, it really is quite staggering what she goes through every year simply to get back to that nest site that she's been using since 2015. And here's a great photo. This was taken by Alan Crofts, who is one of the people involved with the fantastic Osprey photography hide at Horn Mill. Alan took this photo when 30 arrived back last year, when she actually came and spent a few days around Horn Mill, no doubt recuperating from that journey, because when the birds first come back, you can often see them on the nest. They do, without wishing to anthropomorphize too much, they do look tired. And so they do need a few days to recuperate from such a demanding journey before they get into the breeding cycle. So in that case, Horn Mill provided a great place for 30 to replenish her fuel reserves and to recover from that very arduous migration. And some of those trends we've seen with 30 are replicated across the many Ospreys that we've tracked from the UK. So we've been following, we've been satellite tagging Ospreys in the UK, like I said, since the late 90s. And the person who's really pioneered this is Roy Dennis. And as part of my PhD, I analysed the migrations of Ospreys from both Rutland Water and birds that Roy had satellite tagged in Scotland. And there was a fantastic data set of adult birds doing repeated journeys. And you can see there autumn migrations in orange and spring migrations in white. And there were some very clear seasonal differences in those journeys. And what we found is that adult Ospreys do fly further per day in autumn, about an average of 280 kilometers per day, than in spring when it's 40 kilometers less, so 241 kilometers. And that is down to the fact that in autumn, generally weather conditions are more favorable and winds typically are more favorable. And as a result, overall autumn migrations were completed faster, 5 days on average faster than they are in the spring. So an average of 22 days, 3 weeks in autumn and 27 days in spring. So those birds migrating north to the UK at the moment are having a more demanding journey than they do in the autumn. And this is reflected really across the migration route. So this table shows you the average distances and flying times that birds did in both Europe and Africa in autumn and spring. And you can see there that the greatest daily distances on average were migrating through Africa in the autumn, when they averaged 307 kilometers per day, compared to 268 in the spring in Africa. And then in Europe, it was an average of 263 kilometers per day. And then in spring in Europe, 220. So you can see in both sort of sections of the journey, the African section, the European section, they fly less further per day in spring than they do in autumn. And that might be quite counterintuitive, because you think, well, in spring, surely they're more, the urgency to get back to their nest site must be really driving them forward. And that is definitely the case. It's not a lack of urgency. It's just the fact that the weather conditions are much less favorable than they are in the autumn. And you can see here that, interestingly, despite the fact that they achieve different daily distances and they tend to fly further in autumn than spring, the actual ground speeds are pretty similar. Now, the ground speed is the speed of the bird relative to the ground. So if you've got a tailwind and you're flying at, say, 10 meters per second, then that is a lot less energetically costly than it is to fly at 10 meters per second into a headwind, in which case your airspeed in the spring is actually much faster because you're battling against those strong winds. So I think what I'm saying is that when you see an osprey back at its nest site, you really should have a newfound respect for what that bird has probably had to go through in order to get back to that nest site. And this chart here illustrates it really well, because this shows you, this is the weather conditions that subset of birds I just showed you experienced on migration. You can see that generally they had a minus figure on this graph is a tailwind, and a positive figure is a headwind. You can see that in spring they're mainly migrating into headwinds, whereas in autumn they're migrating with tailwinds. So you can see the autumn migration is generally easier than it is in the spring. And as I said, a real clear difference is that in the spring, the birds very rarely make long sea crossings, and that's generally because it's just much more risky when the weather conditions are not favorable. So in the autumn, when you might have a tailwind, when the weather's pretty benign, it might be quite warm still, it's fine to make long sea crossings, in some cases right the way across the Bay of Biscay. And we had one bird, Roy Dennis tagged one bird, Blue XD, who flew direct from his nest site in Strathspey in northern Scotland all the way to Extremadura, over 2,000 kilometers in 36 hours, direct across the Bay of Biscay. And that is a bird not being blown off course, that's a bird that's taking that decision to do that journey. But in spring, they know that it's much more risky because the weather conditions are typically not as favorable, and so they tend to stick to land. So in autumn, longest flight across the sea was 1,300 kilometers. And all of those autumn flights are always undertaken when you've got northeasterly tailwinds, whereas the northwesterly headwinds that tend to, dominate, be prevalent in spring, they prohibit those crossings. And that's why you get flights like 30 who very much avoided making any kind of sea crossing in the spring, whereas in the autumn, she quite often did do it. So it's fascinating to understand that. So when you see that, I think it's even more remarkable to see how predictable some birds can be in their arrival. And this graph here shows you the average arrival dates of different ringed or identifiable ospreys in the Rutland Water population. This is a figure that's in my book, the Poyser book that was published in 2024. And ospreys typically are fairly predictable in their arrival date. So birds that arrive early tend to be early every year, whereas there are some that don't arrive till April. There are others that are nearly always back around the 15th of March. So Blue 25, for those of you who follow the Rutland Osprey project, she's nearly always the first bird back, or one of the first birds back every year. This year she was the first one back, and she was several days earlier than any of the others. So I think it's fair to say she probably winters in Spain, or Portugal, but we don't know that. Whereas there are others that are always that bit later arriving. So 0109, who's not around anymore, but he was a regular, bred at Sci 10 in Rutland for a number of years. He never came back until the very end of March or early April. That was just what he did every year. So you probably suggest he wintered much further south. He might well have been somewhere south, like the Ivory Coast. And that's why he had this later arrival. But sometimes, despite the fact they often are very predictable in their arrival time, sometimes they can be much later. So Maya, for example, there was one year, and I can't remember what year it was off by heart, she was 2 weeks late. And that's probably because she had one of those springs where there were really strong headwinds or crosswinds in the Sahara that meant she had a much more arduous crossing of the desert. And then perhaps she might have been delayed by rain in Europe, just a combination of factors that meant she was late arriving back at Rutland Water. And so you can understand why, 2 years ago when she came back, when she had definite respiratory problems, guess that was probably caused by the fact she'd had a difficult migration. So, it's really fascinating to see, or just to think about what these individual birds are experiencing on their migration. And of course, I always think it must be a real shock to them coming back to northern latitudes, because quite often they're coming back. I mean, certainly if you looked at the Manton Bay nest today, yesterday, not where you probably wanted to be, very exposed. Sometimes particularly in Scotland, they come back to snow, but they're coming back because ultimately they want to reclaim that nest. They want to get back to that nest as soon as possible to ward off any competitors, whether they be Egyptian geese as is the case often at Rutland Water, or just other ospreys, because we know that these established nest sites are where all the young ospreys want to breed. So it's really important, if you're going to breed successfully, that you get back early, you reclaim your nest site. That means much more likely to have a successful breeding season. Anyway, so that's adult ospreys on their spring migration. Another bird who I think is really fascinating, who some of you will have seen these slides before, but I make no apology for showing them again, because it is just the most incredible story. So a question people often ask is, how do ospreys become such good navigators? How do they learn? How do they know where to go on spring migration when they're returning to their nest site? How is it that they've been able to build up that experience? Well, we've learned a lot by the long-term tracking of particular individual ospreys. And I think in the UK, the best example of that is this bird, Blue AE, better known as Rothymercus, who Roy tagged on the Rothymercus estate in Scotland quite some time ago now. It was probably, I think it was about maybe 2012, possibly a bit earlier. Anyway, Rothymercus, I think maybe 2009 actually. Rothymercus, there you go, 10th of August 2009. His tag continued to work for 5 years. So it worked right the way through until the winter of 2014 and 15. And the key thing with him, I mean, same time as 30, but when we tagged 30 for the first time, she was an adult. She'd already done the migration many times before, so she knew what she was doing. Whereas Rothymercus, when we tagged him, or when Roy tagged him, he was a juvenile on his first migration. And the great difference between juveniles and adults is that the juveniles are migrating entirely on instinct. They're not using past experience. So whereas you can say that adults genuinely are navigating in the true sense of the word, they're navigating from a known nest site to a known wintering site, the juveniles are not doing that. They're migrating. They're following their innate tendencies to migrate to a distant wintering site, which in the case of UK birds could be Southern Europe, could be Spain, could be Portugal, or it could be somewhere in West Africa. And they're going to go approximately southwest and then stop somewhere. And eventually they're going to establish a wintering site that they then regard as their winter home they go to every year. But that first migration really is down to A, instinct, and B, a bit of good fortune. And when Rothymercus migrated south for the first time, this was his journey all the way down to Djoudj National Park in Senegal. And you can see there, he did a long sea crossing. But the difference with Rothymercus compared to one of the adult birds we've just been talking about is that long sea crossing was not a choice. That's because there were strong easterly winds which pushed him out into the Atlantic. And the only reason he survived is he landed on a boat off the west coast of Spain and recuperated for several hours before then flying to land. So he flew 1,300 kilometers in 33 hours before making landfall in Portugal. And having got to Portugal, he then spent a month recuperating by a river before then continuing his journey south. And you can see there he crossed from the southwest tip of Portugal down to Morocco and eventually reached Djoudj National Park after a total of 47 days on migration, 13 of which were actual traveling days, so a quick migration in that sense, and 34 days on stopover, the vast majority of which were in Portugal. So Rothymercus successfully made it to West Africa. He then spent 18 months wandering around West Africa, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that a bit later. But then in spring 2011, made his first return to the UK. And that's the thing to remember, that all of the juvenile ospreys that migrated south from the UK last year, they're all going to stay either in Iberia or in West Africa for the whole of this year, and they're not going to return unless there might be the odd exception, but basically the vast majority, 99% of them, will stay on the wintering grounds for the whole of this year. So they're not going to be migrating north. But birds that hatched in 2024, who spent all of 2025 on the wintering grounds, they will be flying north for the first time this spring. They won't be in this first batch of returnees who are just returning over the next few days, there'll be birds who arrive perhaps in April, maybe the end of April, early May, returning for the first time. And of course, that first northward migration is much more demanding because they're not like an experienced adult who knows where they're going. It's only the second time they've undertaken this long migration, and there are hazards along the way. But the interesting thing, if you look at Rothymercus's first spring migration there, which was in 2011, is its similarity really to his first autumn migration. And you can see there that he actually flew up to the north coast of Spain. He didn't return to the river in Portugal that he'd spent a month at in 2009, but he went to an estuary in Galicia on the north coast of Spain before then, unusually, flying direct across the Bay of Biscay and then making landfall at Prawl Point, which was the exact point he'd left from 2 years previously. Now, that is not down to chance. That is because that is what we call one of these goal areas that bird is navigating back to. So he'd remembered that place from his first migration and knew basically instinctively that he needed to get back there, and then returned back to Scotland and spent much of the summer wandering around Scotland. We know that 2-year-old ospreys, too young to breed normally, and they basically are wandering over a huge area, learning where all the nesting ospreys are. He also spent quite a bit of time in Cumbria before then migrating south. And we were really fascinated to see what he was going to do on his next autumn migration, because having had those 2 really long flights across the Bay of Biscay, would Rothymercus maybe try and avoid it? Well, avoid it he did. But the fascinating thing was, having spent 9 days at that estuary in Galicia on his spring migration, he obviously wanted to get back there, but didn't want to fly across the Bay of Biscay. So did this incredible dogleg through France and then across the north coast of Spain to get back there without crossing the sea. So you can really see there that is experience influencing subsequent migrations. And after spending a bit of time in northern Spain, he continued south, and you can see there, then went to the exact point in southwest Portugal. He departed from the previous autumn migration. But in this case, there were strong easterly winds, which pushed him out into the Atlantic. And if he'd been a juvenile, he would undoubtedly have been blown out to sea and died. But now, having done the migration before, having known he needed to get to his wintering site in Senegal, he was able to compensate for those crosswinds, get back on track, get back to the West African coast, and then continue down to his wintering site. But that was a very close shave, because as you can see there, he was flying non-stop for 24 hours and covered nearly 1,300 kilometers before making landfall. So quite incredible. And over the course of those 5 years, there are Rothymercus's journey: spring in white and autumn in orange. And you can really see there how that those early experiences on migration definitely impacted his subsequent flights to and from West Africa. So just fantastic to see how individual birds learn. Now, as I said, as these adult birds currently are migrating back to the UK or arriving back at nest sites, or perhaps they're already back at nest sites, as the case of 33 Mara and CJ7, the juveniles from last year, they're still on the wintering grounds, whether they're in Iberia or whether they're in West Africa. And we know from satellite tracking and colouring sightings that they can wander over a really big area. A great example this year was ATAR3, who was a bird who fledged from a nest in Northamptonshire last year. He's a son of 5H1, which is the bird from Poole Harbour, who fledged from Poole Harbour in 2022. And you can see here that between the 13th and the 18th of February, he flew quite a long way north, 302 kilometers north, through the Gambia and then through Senegal right up to St. Louis. And I remember quite a few people asking at the time, is he beginning his spring migration? Well, he's not, because he's a second calendar year osprey, and the chances are he's going to stay in West Africa. What he's doing is trying to find a wintering site. So he'd been down on the River Alahine, which is on the border between Khartoum and the Gambia, an area that would have had lots of established ospreys, and the established adult ospreys often chase the juveniles away and don't let them settle. So he's perhaps chased away from areas there and went further north and went to the area around Langue de Barbarie, which is another real hotspot for wintering ospreys. And now he'll be chancing his luck there. Will he stay there, or will he perhaps move south again? We don't know because he's not satellite tagged, but hopefully someone like Jean-Marie may well identify him on some future date, and we might well learn where his final wintering site is. But Rothymercus again gave us a really great insight into how these young birds establish that wintering site. So here is Rothymercus. This was when he first arrived in West Africa, and you can see there that he spent quite a lot of time up in Juge National Park before then moving further south to the Saloum Delta, which is a massive area of mangrove swamps in Senegal, a fantastic place. I've been fortunate to go a number of times, and he spent a long time there, 2 months, exploring an area of about 1,400 kilometers squared, before then moving a bit further to the southeast to a tributary of the River Gambia, still over the border in Senegal. And he was much more settled there from March. And the reason is that by March, all of the established ospreys, the adult ospreys, had gone north. And so that gives these juveniles the chance to get established at a wintering site. And that is when they're basically becoming established at that site. And then that is the site they then regard as their future winter home. And it's really fascinating that he remained summer 2010. And by the autumn that year was favouring an area of just 1 kilometre square. So compare that to the previous winter when he first arrived in West Africa, when he was doing these really big exploratory flights. Now he was settled in an area. Then, of course, he flew north and did that first migration back to the UK in 2011. And then when he came back to West Africa, he went back to exactly the same area. And this time was living in an area of just 0.5 kilometres squared. So you can really see the process by which that bird has established his wintering site. And I was really fortunate to go and visit that area in January 2012 with a group from the Rutland Osprey Project. Some of you may even be at the talk tonight. And we managed to see Rothymercus at that wintering site, which was a really fantastic experience. And I have to say that actually going and seeing ospreys on their wintering grounds in West Africa has been a real highlight for me of my involvement with the species. And for me, I love telling this story because it was really fantastic. We were in the Saloum Delta one winter, and we managed to see this osprey perched in the mangroves. And John Wright, who took the photo, could see on the image on the back of his camera that it had a blue ring on the right leg. It wasn't satellite tagged, so it's not a bird that we knew was there, but it had a blue ring on the right leg, which indicated it was probably English or it might have been Welsh. But unfortunately, we couldn't get a close enough view to manage to identify it. So the next day, we changed our plans and we arranged to take the group back to this exact spot because adult bird, we knew it would be there. And sure enough, we went to the spot in the boat. There's John in his hat at the front of the boat. And John managed to take this photo, which showed it was 32, which was a male that had fledged a few years previously from the Manton Bay nest. And it was now breeding with, guess who, 3005 in Northamptonshire. So a really, really fantastic moment. And I was so excited. It's a wonder I didn't capsize that boat, but it was just a magical experience to see a Rutland Osprey, actually a Northamptonshire Osprey, strictly speaking, because by this stage it was breeding in Northamptonshire, on its wintering grounds in West Africa. And for me, that really brings the journey to life, to really understand what these birds experience in their lifetime. It really is, as I said earlier, pretty humbling. And we went back to the same spot 3 years later, and sure enough, there was 32 in exactly the same location. So they really are creatures of habit. And what those trips to West Africa have shown me is that, you know, unfortunately, although it's a fantastic fish-rich area for ospreys, there are also multiple threats to them. And when you think about it, when you think about the talk I'm giving this evening, you really do understand that if you're going to conserve a migratory species, we can do we do a huge amount of work for them in the UK for the breeding grounds. We protect nest sites. We encourage people to come and watch them, but watch them in a way that isn't going to disturb the ospreys or disturb the breeding site. And we educate the general public about them. But that's only a small proportion of their life. To really truly conserve them, you've got to think about the migration route as a whole. And as you've seen tonight, you know, that migration route is 3,000 miles long. So you've got to think about conserving habitats along it. You've got to get people talking along the migration route, but you also have to think about the wintering grounds, because ultimately the birds are there for probably more of their life than they are anywhere else. And in West Africa, just like anywhere else in the world, there are threats which are mainly related to humans, anthropogenic threats. And they are often relate to the fishing industry. So discarded fishing nets are a very obvious threat to a piscivorous bird, not just to ospreys, but to species like terns and other species that occur along that West African coast. And we know that the osprey is a species that can really inspire people about the natural world. And so in the course of visiting West Africa, it became apparent to me and to some of the other people I was with that we could use the osprey as a real flagship species to demonstrate the need to protect migratory birds, just like we use them to raise awareness of conservation issues in this country. We thought it could be done in exactly the same way in West Africa. And so with a fantastic bird guide called Junkung Jidama, we put together a education program that involved Junkung JJ going into schools, teaching the young people about ospreys and migration, and some of the conservation message really spread through those communities as a result. So we had an osprey team that was called Osprey FC. We had schools that organised beach collections to try and remove that very obvious threat to ospreys and other piscivorous birds from the beaches, and other young people who went out with JJ to do a survey of wintering ospreys. So they really got the osprey bug, just like many young people do in the UK. And ultimately, that led me to establishing the Osprey Leadership Foundation as a charity. And our aim is really to inspire and enable young conservation leaders along that ospreys flyway to find their voice and to deliver sustainable environmental change to the world around them. So whether they're in the UK or whether they're in West Africa. And a lot of our work, or a good proportion of our work, is based down in West Africa through partnerships with other organisations. So at the moment, we've got a really fantastic partnership with a brilliant organisation called the Gunjo Project, who have trained up a group of young people, peer educators, to teach other young people to be ambassadors for nature, to basically teach other young people about the amazing migrations that species like ospreys are doing, and to hopefully instill in these communities the need to protect these migratory birds. Because as those Gambians always tell me, those birds have selected their country to winter in, and they want to do everything they can to try and protect them. So this kind of conservation education message, I think, is absolutely crucial to conserving and protecting migratory birds. And the Gunjo Project's peer education program is fantastic. They basically have a classroom session where they're teaching the young people the basics about ospreys. And we've got a book called Be an Osprey Expert, which was written by Jackie and Pete Murray, who used to volunteer on the Rutland Osprey Project and now help us very kindly with OLF. Jackie's also my old biology teacher. Anyway, they then take the kids out on field trips to show them nature and to look for ospreys. And on one of the field trips this winter, I think they saw 17 ospreys on one of the trips they were on. So it just shows you that is a real, Gunjo is a real hotspot for wintering ospreys in West Africa. And what we're now doing is we're linking some of those young people with another group we have called the Osprey Leaders, who meet at Rutland Water. And this is a photo that we took earlier this year of the group actually building an artificial osprey nest, which we're going to put up in the local area. And the young people, the Osprey Leaders, have made a video, which we're now sending to the Gunjo Project to show those young Gambians what we're doing to try and conserve ospreys in this country, to hopefully try and inspire them to do their bit for conservation at the other end of the flyway. And I really feel that, you know, birds like Osprey have this unique way to enable us to link people in this way, which I think can only be good for not just Ospreys, but for conservation in general. And some of the young people that we work with down there, we've been able to organise to come to the UK. So Dembo Jatta on the left with an Osprey, which they actually caught at Cartong Bird Observatory while they were trying to catch waders. That too, who used to breed at the Llynfrenig nest in North Wales, maybe still does. Someone's going to have to tell me whether that's the case. I can't remember, sorry. And then Emmanuel Jatta on the right there, who actually came and did an internship with us 2 years ago, and he ringed Ospreys. We managed to get him to ring an Osprey, at least one Osprey, in England, Wales and Scotland, which was fantastic. That's a photo there with Darren Moore from Friends of the Ospreys at the Pont Croeser nest in North Wales, next to the Glasslyn Wildlife Visitor Centre. And then Nafi Sarr in the middle, we're hoping she's going to come to the UK on an internship in a similar way to learn about the conservation work that goes into Ospreys in this country, so she can go back to the Gambia and hopefully set up similar initiatives down there. And Nafi was one of the first people that we worked with. She was in one of the early pilot groups that we had back in about 2013. So she's someone we've known for a number of years, so I think is going to go on to do great things for conservation. So I said I'd speak for about an hour. That is about an hour. Thank you all very much for listening. If you have posted some questions in the chat, then there's going to be a bit of time now for me to, hopefully with the help of Becky, to go through the answers to some of those questions. But all I would ask tonight is that you might, hopefully if you've enjoyed the talk, you might consider making a donation to OLF. I know some of you already have, which is really fantastic of you. So thank you very much. Even better if you might consider becoming a friend of the Osprey Leadership Foundation, which just means making a small monthly donation, and then you're first to hear about events like this, get discounts on other events we do, and just hopefully safe in the knowledge that your money is helping to educate people about Ospreys and the need to conserve them, and the need to help our young people to be people who can really go on to make change for nature, which, let's face it, the world desperately needs. So thank you all very much. I really hope you've enjoyed the talk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully by the wonders of modern technology there might be a few questions. Becky, are you there?
I am here. Let me just load up these questions. Okay, I'm going to start at the top and see how many we get through. And just apologies, Tim, if you have answered these in the talk and I have missed it. There's been emails, there's been questions, there's been people coming and going. There's been all going on in the background here. Okay, so first question right at the beginning. Over the last few years, the population in Scotland appears on paper at least to have stagnated, whereas England and Wales are on the increase. Is this the case, or is there less data collection, more unmonitored nests?
Oh, good question. I think I wouldn't say the Osprey population in Scotland has stagnated. There are some areas, it's true, that have basically reached their carrying capacity. So in Roy's area, for example, you know, in Murray and Strathspey, that population has been pretty stable for quite a few years now. So we don't think that's increasing. However, if you look at some places further south, so areas like the Lake of Menteith, which is in Stirlingshire, they're still increasing there, and they're still increasing in other parts of the south of Scotland. So I think it's fair to say that it's not stagnating, but it's just in some parts it's not. It's now got to the point where it's not increasing. It's just stable. Whereas on the sort of the kind of outer area of the range, it is still at that stage where it's increasing, but not increasing as fast as it is in England and Wales, because it's really fantastic to see how well they are doing south of the border.
There's a follow-up to that question, Tim. Is the Osprey population in England and Wales at a point where translocation is no longer necessary?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's not necessary, because the great thing with translocation, what we've been able to show with the work we've done at Rutland Water and more recently at Poole Harbour, is that translocations are effective at helping the osprey to spread its range. So I think potentially there is still a place for translocation, but the good thing now is that the ospreys are actually starting to do it themselves, because I worked out the other day and I think there are now ospreys breeding in, something like 10 counties in England, 10 or 11 counties in England. I can't remember exactly what it is, but they're really starting to spread out, and it's a long way from being what it should be, because it's a bird that should be common across the whole of the UK. It might never get to the case of red kites, but I think it could certainly become a lot more numerous than it is now. So there's still a long way to go.
Okay, next one is from Miriam. Perhaps you'll already cover this, but interested in your insights on A, feeding habits during migration, and B, trends of slowly more birds wintering in Iberia.
Yeah, so, well, the first part of that question, feeding on migration. So the osprey is, because of the way it feeds, what tends to happen is that, at somewhere like Rutland Water, the reason that thank you to the person who's just confirmed that LJ2 is still breeding at Lynbrennig. I should have known that, but I'm sorry, I was a bit, it was the end of the talk, so you'll have to just excuse me. Slap on the wrist from the Brennig team, I'm sure. Anyway, we started to see ospreys passing through migration at Rutland Water, through, well, particularly during the late 80s and the early 90s. And that's because the birds would stop off as they continued north. And that's what they do across their migration route. So they'll often roost near a lake, a reservoir, or along the sea. Thanks, Sarah, for forgiving me. Thank you. They'd stop somewhere and then they'll feed either that evening or early the next morning before continuing their journey. The only time, obviously, that the birds aren't able to do that is when they're going across the Sahara. So when they're going across the Sahara, it can be 5, 6, 7 days without food. And interestingly, I said at the start of the talk that ospreys don't need to put on fat in the way that, some passerines might do before they start migration, but they do still deposit fat before they start, because Roy and I satellite tagged a adult male osprey that we caught at Rothimerca's fish farm, and whereas males normally weigh about 1.5 kilograms during the breeding season, this bird in September, early September, just before it left on migration, was 2 kilograms. So it obviously put on weight before it continued its journey, before it started its migration. And that definitely helps when they get to challenging parts like the Sahara. What was the second part of the question, Becky? Sorry.
It was trends of slowly more birds wintering in Iberia.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So there's definitely, well, I mean, as I showed you in the talk, there's a trend for more ospreys to be wintering in West Africa as well. So it could just be virtue of the fact that the European population is increasing, and so there's just more birds, and so therefore there's more birds in Iberia and Spain. It's difficult to unpick it all, but there's certainly a trend for more birds to be wintering in Iberia, and there's no doubt that birds that do that, as you've seen tonight, the migration is just easier. You can't get away from the fact that they don't have to cross the Sahara, they don't have to fly as far, and they probably return to their breeding sites earlier. So there is the possibility that those birds will pass on the it could be a case of survival of the fittest. Those birds that use that migration route might breed more successfully, and there might be an increasing prevalence for other birds in the population to do it. So that's going to be something that we'll have to keep monitoring.
Okay, next one from Caroline. Do you think that Maya and 33 arriving together several times and being delayed by exactly the same time this year suggests they might by chance winter in the same or very close location?
It could be, but I mean, it's. I don't know how many times they've arrived on the same day. I'll bet someone in this call will be able to tell me. It could be 4 times, is it? So maybe 3 times, which is quite an amazing coincidence. So I don't know. I think it's probably just chance. It's just the fact that their arrival dates happen to be similar, and so by coincidence. Often they arrive on the same day, but just like 3005 and 0998 wintered 2 kilometers apart in West Africa, it could be that that's what happens with Maya and 33. But as we know, male and female ospreys establish their wintering site before they pair up. So we know for a fact they don't migrate together. They go at separate times and they go to their own wintering site. So they won't have seen each other since September last year when they left. So I think it's probably just coincidence, but it's amazing. And I have to say, when Maya turned up yesterday, I just thought that was just such a fantastic moment. It was brilliant.
Okay, next one is from Louise. Are any UK Ospreys still satellite tagged?
Good question. I'm not sure there are any satellite tagged at the moment. I mean, that's not to say they shouldn't be in the future. I mean, I think we've obviously learned a great deal by satellite tagging birds, and it's enabled us to really, hopefully, as you've seen tonight, understand the migration very well. But I think there's still a place to do it if you've got the right project. If you want to, I think you have to have a good justification for doing it. I think you have to have a clear purpose, a clear objective, what you're trying to learn. But I think there is scope to satellite tag more in the future. Yes.
How many do you want to do, Tim?
Keep going. How many more are there?
There's quite a few.
Are there?
Yeah.
Let's get through as many as we can. Let's go through till 9 o'clock. See how many more we can do in 7 minutes.
Okay. So the next one's from Angela. Ospreys seem uniquely recognisable as individuals to our eyes by their feather colorations and patterns. Could you comment on this in any way relative to other birds? For example, is it just that their colour and pattern variations sit well within our visible colour range?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, there is no doubt that the Ospreys recognise each other in the way that we as humans recognise each other. They obviously know who their mate is. I mean, it doesn't stop 33 fraternising with other females. It's not like it's mistaken identity. He knows exactly what he's doing. But I suppose, to us, the differences can be subtle, but they can be quite obvious. I mean, John Wright, who Becky and I, we both worked with him for many years at Rutland Water. He was really one of the people who pioneered the fact that you can identify ospreys by the markings on their underwings. So the spots and the kind of flecks and the various markings you have on their underwings, on the underwing coverts, on the carpal joint, even on the flanks, they are all unique to each individual osprey and they don't change year to year. So you can identify a bird year to year simply on those spots on the underwings. Likewise, the head pattern. I mean, I know I looked at the Manton Bay YouTube chat yesterday and I saw all the chat about the X on Maya's head, which is really distinctive and enables us to identify her. So they are prominent features and they are obvious to us, but there are similar species who have, perhaps more subtle variations, which perhaps are less obvious to the human eye. But I have to say that even then, someone like John is much better at identifying the differences than someone like me, because he's just got the eye for it. And so I'm not sure I'm answering the question very well, but I am saying that, there are, it is possible to identify ospreys, quite well by those markings.
Okay, another question from Caroline. Do you think there could be many UK ospreys wintering in perhaps under-recorded areas further north in Africa, like Morocco, the Western Sahara and Mauritania? Yeah,
I do. I mean, there have been some birds that we satellite tagged in the very early years who wintered in southern Mauritania, and there are some that do winter north of the Sahara. I'm not sure whether they're particularly under-recorded, because people do go to those areas and they do monitor what's going on. So I think it's a fact that the vast majority that cross the sea to Morocco will almost certainly continue south of the Sahara. So they are going to go down to West Africa. Whereas, some of that habitat in Portugal and southern Spain does definitely hold some of them. It's really fantastic. If you've been to somewhere like Cadiz Harbour, it's a bit like going to West Africa. The ospreys are really numerous, and some of the photos that we get, from places in Portugal, are fantastic, because those areas are just really, really good for wintering ospreys. Whereas there's not the same numbers that winter in places like Morocco. So I think most that get to Africa do then continue south across the Sahara.
Okay, next question is from Andrew. With regards to migration, would the birds be in better condition during the autumn migration, where there's more flying during breeding, than coming back after wintering, where they've been sitting around on the beach?
I think they will be in better condition in the spring for sure. And that's probably just as well, because as you've seen today, the spring migration is generally more challenging because generally the weather's poorer, there's stronger winds. And that, that's definitely been the case this year seems to be that quite a lot of birds got held up at the beginning of their migration. And I mentioned 30 specifically who left later than she normally would do. But obviously they've had the whole winter to recuperate from the breeding season. I mean, at the end of the breeding season, I think males in particular, if you think they've been foraging throughout the season, they've been feeding their chicks, they have it quite hard. And there are some males, so it's really interesting in Roy's area. If you go to Findhorn Bay on the Murray Firth in the autumn, you see lots of male ospreys perched in Findhorn Bay. And what they're doing is they're spending a lot of time down there. They're not going back to their nest sites because they know that if they go back to their nest sites, they just get hassled by the juveniles who want to get fish off them. Whereas they can go to Findhorn Bay and have a bit of peace and quiet and feed up, and then every now and again take a fish back to the nest. So I think that they do have techniques they can use to try and get into good condition before the start of autumn migration, but it's probably more challenging for them in that respect in autumn, even though the weather's more benign.
Okay, next question. What is the attraction of the UK as a breeding site? For example, why not stay in Senegal?
Good question. A lot of people ask this. I think the main thing, the main advantage to coming further north is you get longer days. So as you go further north with latitude, obviously you get longer days. So if you're male osprey, you can be out fishing at 4 o'clock in the morning and you can potentially still be out fishing at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, certainly if you go into Scotland. So they have longer per day to feed their chicks. There's also less, in West Africa, there could be competition with species like African fish eagle. But I think the main thing is that the birds are just very site faithful and they want to come back to the place they were reared in. And so that's why they end up returning here. The one exception could be, so there's a population on Cape Verde, which is sedentary. And when that was analysed genetically, those birds on that population were found to resemble those in Northern Europe. So it's thought that that population was founded by birds that were basically blown off course, ended up in the Cape Verde Islands, and then remained sedentary. So they didn't then subsequently migrate. And there is a phenomenon that birds that end up on islands become non-migratory as a result. So that's really interesting. But I think just the urge to get back to their breeding grounds in the UK is just too strong, and that's generally why they come north.
Okay, that takes us to 9 o'clock, Tim.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry if we've not managed to answer all your questions, but all I will say is thank you very much for joining us tonight. Sorry for the slight technical hitches at the beginning, but I'm delighted that we managed to overcome them. I'm very relieved we managed to overcome them as well. But thank you all very much, and thanks Becky for managing to do all the technical stuff behind the scenes and for going through those questions. So yeah, Valerie's just said she'll email her question. Please feel free to post them on social media to the Osprey Leadership Foundation accounts, and we'll do what we can to answer anything that we've not managed to answer tonight. So thank you very much for joining us.
Superb.